Two announcements. Hi, I'm Lee Humphreys. I am the current director of the Center for Social Sciences Qualitative and Interpretive Research Institute. I'm also a professor and current chair of the communication department here at Cornell. Before we begin today, I would like to first recognize that Dr. Elizabeth Fox has won the 2023 Trevor Pinch QuIRI Innovation Award for her creative and engaged learning of qualitative methods in public health. So she will be giving a seminar in the fall on her work, so please look for that. And second, this is actually my last QuIRI seminar that I'll be running. My term has come to an end, and I'm so pleased to announce that Professor Sharon Sassler will be taking over as QuIRI director. And I particularly want to thank Erica Abbott, a PhD student in sociology who has been working with me on QuIRI for the past few years, as well as the leadership team, including the late Trevor Pinch, Sharon, Linda Shi in CRP, and Marina Welker in anthropology. So it is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Uriel Abulof, a visiting associate professor in the Department of Communication here at Cornell, and an associate professor at Tel-Aviv University's School of Political Science, Government, and International Affairs. So with that, I will turn it over to him.
Thank you so much, Lee. Thank you so much, and congratulations to Sharon. Mazel tov. So yes, we have an intimate gathering now, and I think that perhaps the best way to start is simply by saying that I have no answers. I mostly have questions, and I would love all of us to be part of a sort of a conversation. I don't know exactly how to facilitate that, but basically it's up to you. Whenever you have anything in mind, whether a comment or a question, they're obviously completely free to intervene and just speak your words. So I thought of starting with that image, that photograph that really captured my imagination. Let me share that with you. You see it all over your screen? Cool. Okay. So what do we see? No, you tell me. I know the answer. Well, I guess I'm asking those of you who do not know the answer. What do you think that we're seeing now?
It looks like soap suds.
Mm-hmm. Can you think where this photograph is taken from?
South Asia, India, somewhere.
Yeah. India.
So
it's and at first, when I was looking at that image for a brief moment, I thought maybe that's a snow.
Yeah.
And you're right, it's not a snow, it's a foam. But what is even more remarkable is that it's not just a foam, it's toxic foam taken from a toxic river. And it's part of a celebration. It's part of a celebration run in Delhi every year for about 4 days, celebrating the sun, the god of sun, struggling to shine. That's part of a celebration. I was truly mesmerized by that image, trying to figure it out, to relate to it in one way or another. And I think that I was transfixed by the perplexity, by the puzzle. Not merely by the fact that they are all there in that toxic river, but that they're enjoying themselves so much. And especially the woman at the center. Right? So when we look at that photograph, we obviously use our senses, right? Especially sight. We look at the image, we see something. And in one way or another, we can immediately relate to at least one aspect of that lady's experience, happiness. Right? You can clearly see that in her facial expression. This is happiness. And then we learn, like I learned when I read that piece, like you learned when you listened to me saying it, that it's in fact a toxic river, a toxic foam. that in that joyful moment, she might be truly jeopardizing her health, her life. Hence the puzzle, hence the puzzle, the question mark that hovers over us when we look at it. And that's part of the dynamics of phenomenology, trying to relate to someone else's experiences through ours. And like often happens, this raises a host of puzzles, interesting puzzles that we're trying to make sense of. Now, one way to look at that puzzle, the puzzle of that photograph, is to focus only on that occasion itself, on these people in that moment. But we can readily take that moment, that photograph, to mean something that goes far beyond it. For example, an ongoing puzzle in political science, in economy, and other fields of social sciences is the juxtaposition of India and China, the relative success of China, the relative failure of India, in various factors that social scientists measure. Can that photograph give us a hint about that failure? One way to look at it. You can also take it to mean something more personal. Look how happily she basks in that toxicity. And it's interesting that since Trump was elected, there was a rise in the discourse about toxicity, especially about toxic leaders, toxic people. And can that image, can a phenomenological research onto that can help us understand why some people are attracted to toxic leaders, why they hold fast to that toxicity? When I was visiting in various US universities, I myself was often perplexed at the extent to which American scholars struggled to grasp certain realities in my own country, in Israel, and beyond that, in the region. I remember various workshops in which prominent scholars were trying to figure out things that were going about in our region, be that the rise of ISIS or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And often that puzzle came from a certain insistence that you should be decoding people through a certain rational model. And sometimes it just doesn't work. And I think that part of the reason that it sometimes doesn't work is that there is more to the explanation of human behavior, thinking, beliefs, than mere rationality. In fact, sometimes the lens of rationality can obscure our mind in figuring out what surrounds us. And so I wonder to what extent phenomenology can open a certain portal onto them. Now, it's interesting that if you look at the discourse on phenomenology, and especially that phrase, which I find very interesting, it's phenomenal. It's on a continuous rise. And it's interesting in it by itself. Why do we use that phrase? Now, one explanation could be that phenomenon is about appearances. Maybe we do inhabit now a world in which appearances is increasingly important. That what matters is how things appears, the world of appearances. But of course, in philosophy, phenomenology means something else, more extensive. It is about the study of people's lived experiences, and importantly, from first-person point of view. This is generally how we define phenomenology. Now, since much of what comes in the philosophical line of phenomenology comes from Germany, it's interesting to examine very briefly two concepts, the Umwelt and the Lebenswelt. The Umwelt is basically the self-centered world of each and every organism, right? And it doesn't necessarily apply to humans, right? Every animal that you can think of has their own Umwelt, their sensory and semiotic model of the world. Can we ever tap into that? And of course, there is the concept of life world, employed by Jules and others. and that refers more specifically to the human experience of the world. Now, of course, this is a messy stuff. It's very hard to understand that because, well, human life are messy. And so it is often, I guess, the case that we may wonder, what should we do with that mess? Should we suppress the mess or should we bless the mess? And I guess that in some ways, what phenomenology is trying to do is go for the latter. Try to tap into how we express that mess. But of course, it's a big question of why we should go ahead and do that in any case. And by now, I think we have quite substantial research indicating the importance of experience. This is a couple of words from John Dewey, who stipulated a first-rate test for philosophy, for any philosophy. Does it end in conclusions which, when they are referred back to ordinary life experiences and their predicaments, render them more significant, more luminous to us, and make our dealings with them more fruitful? I guess that in many ways, phenomenology, and at that political phenomenology, is the way to tap into it. And what recent studies have shown, including the one that I mentioned down there below, is that the deepest knowledge humans possess is gained through experience. Okay, that study in particular was about COVID. How do people gain knowledge about COVID? And what that study figured out was that overwhelmingly people are more motivated by the knowledge that is gathered through experience than by descriptive means. That is, for example, if you would look at statistics in the newspaper, right? If you look at charts, that's very interesting. But a far deeper knowledge is gained through experience, which makes sense to turn to a method that is all about tapping into experience. Now, I should readily disclose that, at least for me, political phenomenology is at least partly the result of my interest in what I call political existentialism. And Shirley, who is now with us, has been a partner in that journey for quite some time now. And we have an elaborated definition of what political existentialism is all about, but I guess that one sentence captured the gist of it. Mortal free humans search for meaning, their raison d'être, in, of, by, and for politics. But we're focusing now specifically on phenomenology. And in that regard, it's interesting to look at the very famous question by Thomas Nagel: what is it like to be a bat? And basically, the key question of phenomenology, political phenomenology, at that, is what it is like to be human, and a human, sometimes a specific human, in politics. And we can expand that to endless possible questions, such as those that are mentioned in that slide, right? What is it like to be Ukrainian amidst the Russian invasion, Palestinian under military occupation, a Tunisian at the onset of the Arab Spring, a teenager on the brink of a cataclysmic climate, or an Israeli facing a democratic backsliding? And obviously, I refer to myself. And so, just briefly mentioning my recent sort of lived experience that relates to our discussion today. So the day before yesterday, on Wednesday, I was taking the train from my home, Jerusalem, to my university at Tel Aviv. It's a very lengthy drive. But on the train, it was interesting, at the very least, to see almost the entire packed place rise up and for about a whole hour just giving the morning prayer, Shacharit in Hebrew. And they were covered with the talit. This is what you see on them, and the tefillin on them. Okay, interesting in it by itself, nice. And then I was arriving to Tel Aviv University to give a talk about what does it mean to be Jewish today amidst the crisis that engulfed Israel and to a certain extent the Jewish people? And I relate to various aspects there. We're trying to liken Israel to the golem of Prague, to those of you familiar with that symbol. And that was interesting in it by itself. But then it struck me when I had a meeting later with several students, sort of a group that we orchestrated to try and make our own contribution to the fight for liberal democracy in Israel. And for whatever reason, maybe it was the ride on the train, maybe it was the talk that I gave just 2 or 3 hours before, I asked them to tell me what it meant to them to carry Israeli flag during the demonstrations. Because, and this is an important thing to note of the current democratic backsliding in Israel and the demonstrations against it, the key symbol that the demonstrators have been using is Israeli flag. Overwhelmingly so. And they told me about their experiences, about what is it like to carry that flag, and sometimes to rub the flag around you, like those members of Knesset that you see in the upper left image. It was about fear of what might happen. It was about a sense of protection, a sense of responsibility, of solidarity, of coming together. Various answers were given. But what struck me happened a couple of moments after that meeting, when I read about the Israeli flag, something that I knew, I guess, when I was a child, but had to read again to recall it. The flag of Israel was basically modeled after the talit, that religious fabric that you wear, in terms of both the shapes and the colors. That was a sacred aspect of Judaism, and it has become an element of almost civil religion in Israel itself. And it made it all the more interesting, and I think illuminating, to see people demonstrating for democracy in Israel, overwhelmingly secular Israelis, although of course there are many religious as well, who are using the flag the way that religious Jews, believers, cover themselves with the talit. Almost as if you are trying to suggest that this is the sacred canopy that you are now embracing, in line with the literature that we're familiar with about civil religion. So that's one way to tap very briefly into political phenomenology in order to gather something that is both empirical and theoretical in our understanding of political life. Now, I don't know to what extent we'll have time by the end of the discussion to further elaborate on what's going on in Israel. So what I'll do now, I'll move to more theoretical, methodological aspects. And Lee, you will tell me when you think it's, I don't know, about 5 minutes before we should be wrapping up. And
Will do.
Okay. So this is a horrible painting. The only excuse that I can give is that I created that through AI. I couldn't really manage to get what I wanted. What I really wanted is to have Isaac Newton sitting below the tree with an apple falling on his head, and a kid up above throwing that apple on him, which is obviously not what the original story is all about. And the reason, of course, is that if we would be sitting under a tree and we'll be hit by an apple, we'll be asking ourselves, why? What just happened? And we might be looking up there and we will see the kid throwing apples. And so in some ways, here we have an answer, right? Sort of an answer that I called outside in. Outside because it's in the outside world. It's an objective cause. It's palpable. We can see it. We can see the kids. We just spelled the apple. And here we find causality. There is a cause and an effect. And we can observe the cause, the kid with the apple throwing at us. But of course, we all know where that story is coming from. And we know it goes deeper than that. Right? because we ask ourselves, is there anything beneath that layer? And of course, here we find gravity. And here we have a sort of outside, not outside, but outside in terms of out of sight. It is a cause, it is outside of us, it is objective, but it is out of our sight. We cannot behold it. It's, again, gravity. And thinking about it, it's quite remarkable. Gravity affects everything in our life, literally everything in our life. And yet we cannot see it. It's a cause that we cannot see. It's beyond our senses. All that we have are the phenomenon, right? The palpable aspects of it. Now, of course, we can go even deeper. We can go for sort of inside out and hypothesize about certain things about that kids above us, subjective reasons, motivations for throwing that apple at us. That's another way to find an answer to the why. Why has that just happened? And what we have with phenomenology is taking that one step further, not just inside out, but inside out, trying to gain some inner understanding of what went on. The political phenomenology does not explain away people's behavior through external objective causes, but try to explain through the people's own subjective and often enough intersubjective, because it's politics, experiences. And I think one way to look at it is, imagine that, are you familiar with Johari's window? It's a very cool construct, I think, right? There are things that we know about ourselves, things that we don't know about ourselves. There are things that others knows about us and things that they do not know about us. And so when there is coalition of knowledge, we have what he called the arena. Things that we know about ourselves and others knows about us as well. But of course, so much of life, perhaps more than that, the arena, is outside of it. That is, things that I don't know about myself, but others do. These are my blind spots. And the reverse, things that I know about myself, but I don't let other people know. This is the sort of facade that they carry around. And of course, there is that big unknown, things that both myself and others do not know. And what phenomenology is basically about is to move from the arena as much as possible through the facade and the blind spots to try and get to that great unknown. And in that regard, I want to say that I am unhappy with the term phenomenology. I think it's a very, potentially at least misleading concept. Because it is prima facie, right? Literally, about the experience that is observable. And so much of the human experience is unobservable. You cannot observe it. And this relates to a concept that Kant coined, the nominal. And so in some ways, I think, we should conjoin phenomenology with what we might call nominology, gaining knowledge about the unobservable. And perhaps aspects of that are captured by that concept of qualia, what it is like to, whatever, do something, be someone. And I think it's a wonderful question. It's so simple on the face of it. What is it like? And I think partly what is wonderful about that question is that it's a sort of an invitation. Okay? So Sharon, I can ask you what it is like to be you. It's obviously, I don't know. I have no idea. But you do. And once that question is out there, it is an invitation for us to self-reflect, to try and figure out ourselves and convey that to others. And the thing is, the remarkable thing about it is that people often enough are willing to make that effort, to both ask and try to answer. Now, look, I should say, I mentioned before political existentialism and all of that. I should say that it's sort of an odd couple, existentialism and phenomenology. And in philosophy and methodology too, you see it all over the place. They are conjoined. But that's very odd. That's a very odd couple. It looks natural. I mean, if you think about Heidegger, for example, on the right side in this image. Okay, both phenomenology, Husserl, and all of that, and existentialism. Fine. But go back to that definition of phenomenology, the lived experience. Now, why would people add lived? It seems completely redundant. Would it be sort of a dead experience? What's the alternative to lived experience? Can I experience something if I'm not alive? So it's obviously not that. We mean something else. And typically it is not explicit. Occasionally you can see it in the literature. And what people usually mean, even if they don't think about it, when they speak about the lived experience, is that it is unreflective. Or sometimes people would say that it is post or pre-reflective. At that moment itself, supposedly, that experience is unreflective. And here I think it's problematic. It's problematic from an existential point of view because existentialism is, I wouldn't say all, but profoundly about reflection. Because existentialism is profoundly about freedom, about meaning making. Now, there is no way to be free if you're not reflective. What is the meaning of making a choice, of being free, if you do not see before yourself a certain crossroad and reflect whether to turn right, left, or wherever? Take away reflection and you have no freedom. So lived experience in it by itself, according to that lens, should be really at odds with existentialism, which makes both of them sort of an odd couple. And here, and we don't have time to get into that, I think it's interesting to think about the difference between Heidegger's Dasein concept, which is a very raw experience that has a lot to do with that sense of phenomenology, and Jasper's existentialism, which is about existence with Z, that is about the human capacity to move from one mode to another, to go beyond the cocoons that we often enough trap ourselves in. And what came to my mind is, yes, it ain't necessarily so, because that's what existentialism is basically about. It ain't necessarily so. Not just about, what you read in the Bible. Everything. It ain't necessarily so. And it is those moments when reflection kicks in, realizing that it ain't necessarily so, that there is freedom, that I think phenomenology writ large, right, combining with actually phenomenology, the quality and all of that, becomes so much more fascinating. William James, I think, did something very cool in thinking about those issues. He likened that wonderful stream of our consciousness to a bird's alternation of flights and perchings. Right? Sometimes it flies, sometimes it sits. And he thought that trying to capture that, our consciousness, our experience of existence, sometimes when we try to catch the bird when it's flying, right, unreflective, it's like trying to catch the flight is like seizing a spinning top to catch its motion, or trying to turn up the gas quickly enough to see how the darkness looks, which I think is a wonderful method. Because this is it. I mean, think about that image, that photograph of that young woman so happy amidst that toxic foam. If you are happy, and at that moment, you think about your happiness, something by activating reflection changes. At that moment, the bird stopped flying. It is now sitting reflecting. It's very hard then to go back to that flight. In the same way that it's very hard to go to the darkness once you turn on the light in order to behold the darkness. But in my mind, it's imperative. And it's not unlike what we have in our universe. where dark energy and dark matter actually constitute about 95% of the universe around us. So much of what we have in life is about that. And so tapping into that, I think, is a vital task for all human sciences, humanities or the social sciences. So, practically, how do we go about doing that? So, as I was basically hinting before, the sources can be either reflective or reflexive, right? That is unreflective. And in both, there are a host of possibilities. The important thing to know when it comes to reflective expression is that people often, not always, of course, are eager to tell us. What is vital is for us to learn how to listen to. And you see, the many possibilities that we have when it comes to reflective expressions. Most of them overwhelmingly, obviously, through words, right? It could be interviews or discourse analysis, which is mainly what I've been doing in my research. Focus groups, surveys, observational studies of various sorts, participatory action research, which is basically what I've done with the students, speaking about the flags, etc. So all of these are possibilities when it comes to reflective expressions. And then we have some reflexive, that is unreflective expressions. And all of these, I think, are remarkably important. What is worth noting here is that, yes, even when people are not telling us, they are actually telling us. We just have to be extra careful, extra watchful for those signs. And these could be signs of dreams and symbol, things in popular culture, facial expression, right? Like with that woman, right? We saw in the facial expression, she was happy. And behavior. I mean, what happens, that's the reason that I brought that image. What happens when you don't speak to a person, but you see them walking in front of you, and you see them seemingly carelessly throwing the garbage onto the street. And then you see them looking behind them just for a bit. That in it by itself is an indication of a mental state, a way for us to tap into their experience. Of course, it would be helpful to have a conversation with them after that, but even that brief moment can provide us with the lens. Another important aspect of phenomenology, of course, are the modes of analysis and the criteria of analysis. In my mind, at least, two modes are especially useful: thematic analysis. And in the literature, you can see often people distinguishing between transcendental phenomenology, which is about making meaning across the data, to hermeneutic phenomenology, which engages reflexivity. That is the researcher's subjective experience about what they are studying. Both of them are very useful, I think, in phenomenology or phenomenological research, and grounded theory too. That is a sort of iterative data collection and analysis, going back and forth and developing the theory until you reach a certain saturation, theoretical saturation. Now, I would conclude that part before moving into an actual example of such a research focusing on politics by suggesting that one, I think, of the most revolutionary aspects, if we take phenomenology writ large again to the edge, is the criteria of falsifiability. In phenomenology, this is my take on it. In phenomenology, the falsifiability lies partly with the people whom you study. That is to say, practically speaking, I don't know how many minutes we'll have after that, but to the extent that, and I will be talking about the democratic experience in Israel, the demonstration, etc., the falsifiability lies partly, entirely, but partly with me giving these sort of talks, which I have been doing over the past couple of months, and listening to people's reaction to it. I would like to hear them telling me that what I'm saying is either accurate enough or complete nonsense, or whatever lies in between. Is partly what phenomenological falsifiability is all about. Because if you try to tap into the experiences of people, you should be listening to the people whom you study when you convey your research. And you can do it while you are researching, which is what I'm trying to do throughout these last couple of months, in order to refine again and again and again and again those inside-out arguments that I'm making. And I can tell you that what I'm about to show you now has been going through many, many, many such iterations. So it's a sort of almost an elaborated grounded theory that involved our sort of object of inquiry, but really subject, full human subject that should be considering what we might be suggesting, what we might hypothesize. So let's get into a couple of those insights that I gathered over the last couple of months. But first, my yeah, I've been intrigued by that concept of the agora. Now, we use it very, very often when we speak about democracy. Obviously, taking from ancient Greece, the marketplace. And we use that in order to refer to the marketplace of ideas. Right? This is what agora is all about. And this is supposedly one element that is really at the heart, at the core of democracy. But then I was wondering about that other concept of agoraphobia, which we're familiar with, right? In terms of the anxiety which can be of closed or open places. But what is at the heart of agoraphobia is the fear of no exit. And I think that in many ways, agoraphobia captures the experience of democracy, not just agora. It is the experience of democracy because what democracy invites are so many voices, so many ideas, so many people who think differently. And this can be daunting. And this can create the anxiety of no exit of those various contending voices all around you, especially when those voices are inside your head. Sometimes you just want to exit them. And to exit that means exiting liberal democracy, which of course triggers the opposite fear. A fear not just of losing your liberties, which is obviously important in liberal democracies, but the fear of no existence in the existentialist sense, of losing our freedom, losing our sense of choice. And I think it's interesting to think about the title of Jean-Paul Sartre's play, No Exit, and the extent to which it sometimes boils down to no existence. There is no way to exist in such a climate where hell is other people. And that's important, I think, to understand that for many people, for many citizens, democracy is exactly that hell. Hell is especially other people in democracy. And in terms of the literature on that, from that perspective, I'm almost obviously, now you having heard everything I had to say about that, I really like the works of Erich Fromm. And this is just, one insight that he provided us. Speaking about the Escape from Freedom, right, this renowned book. The first mechanism of escaping is the tendency to give up the independence of one's own individual self and to fuse oneself with somebody or something outside oneself in order to acquire the strength which the individual self is lacking. The more distinct forms of these mechanisms are to be found in the strivings for submission and domination, or as we would rather put it, in a masochistic or sadistic striving. Facing agoraphobia in that regard leads to at least those two modes of fleeing our freedom. Either seeking domination, right, the sadistic drive, or subordination, submission, the masochistic drive. in order to relinquish ourselves of that burden. And conversely, think about the work of Karl Mannheim, who was talking about the democratic personality, which I think is remarkable, the way that he puts it. The important element in this conception of integrative behavior is that the person who acts in its spirit is not only unwilling to superimpose his own view and will upon the other fellow, right? Think again about what Bohm was telling us. The essence of domineering attitude, but he is tolerant of disagreement. He's tolerant in the expectations of enlarging his own personality by absorbing some features of a human being essentially different from himself. Practically, this means that the democratic personality welcomes disagreement because it has the courage to expose itself to change. I know that I imagine that the five of us here, and perhaps many more others that perhaps will see this presentation, would say, well, we're all like that. I don't think so. I think that we all have the elements of what I'm about to show you now. We all have that element of fearing that sense of honor, of feeling that exposition, and both exposing our fragility and being exposed to the other's will and ideas. So let's take it back to Israel. And this is part of the study that I've been working on. And this is on a personal level. We'll get after that if we have time to the collective level, but this is on a personal level. Two individuals have been working on other Israeli politicians as well, but let's think about these two. About Netanyahu, the prime minister, and Ben-Gvir, who has become a prominent politician and a senior minister in Netanyahu's current government. Now, a couple of months ago, I read something that stuck with me and struck me immediately. A biography of Netanyahu, in which it was revealed that his favorite film is Straw Dogs. This is the poster from Straw Dogs. Any one of you watched that film? No? It's hard for me to recommend that film. It's not that good. It is experiential in many ways. It's very visceral, but especially it is very, very violent. It is one of the most violent films that I can recall from my youth. I saw it when I was, I don't know, 16, 17, whatever. And I still remember it. It's a vicious film about an academic, a mathematician. He arrives with his wife to countryside in Britain, to their new house. And from that moment on, it's a sort of an ongoing onslaught. At first psychological, and then physical. He is threatened every step of the way, partly by his own wife, who seems to be infatuated by one of her former lovers. And he strikes back with the most hideous violence that you can think of, to protect his house, to protect his home, and to project in some ways his mastery, not least over his wife. And that's Netanyahu's favorite film. So I haven't spoken at all in my life with Netanyahu. All I've done was following the discourse. It has been puzzling me for years now. Both Netanyahu himself and the power of attraction that he holds in the Israeli public. But I can honestly say that the most clarifying, edifying moment about Netanyahu that I've had was reading that single sentence, that this is Netanyahu's favorite film. Knowing that, having watched the film, clarifies so much. It almost connects all those dots. And of course, not all the dots, because it couldn't be that simple. But this is one mode in which political phenomenology can work out. Knowing that sentiment in the heart and minds of people. Then there is another illustration of how political phenomenology can work and look like. With Ben-Gvir, I have spoken. We had a conversation 2 days before the election. It was rather a long conversation and very interesting at that. And what I found was an anxious individual with a very deep sense of inferiority and superiority. And of course, the two often go together. Now, Ben-Gvir, to those of you familiar with his life and his rhetorics, he might seem as a racist individual. And I would argue that he is. But what was remarkable to me in that conversation, again, trying to gain that insight into his mindset and experiences, was that he referred again and again to racism. But basically racism that is leveled against Jews. He sees himself as a defender against racism targeting Jews. He sees himself as the protector of people who have been humiliated constantly. And when you hear Ben-Gvir speaking, it's very hard not to think, not to link that to Netanyahu's frame of mind. And the way that, and this is in other aspects of my research about Netanyahu, if you look at his discourse, his emphasis on survival and strength. This is social Darwinism through and through. And the way that Netanyahu emphasized elements of weakness and humiliation. And you see that resonating with Ben-Gvir too, who at one point spoke about how he admires and loves Netanyahu. That's one way to use political phenomenology in order to tap into the personal dimension, the mindset, the hearts of the individual. Of course, we can look at it from a sociological, a social perspective. One study, for example, found that among the many parameters in Israeli mentality, in one aspect, Israel really stands out, seeking to avoid uncertainty, far more than overwhelmingly other societies. And this may remind you of what Menheim had to say about the democratic personality, and why it is sometimes very, very hard, especially if you live in a place like Israel. Not least because Israel is a place, regardless of the democratic challenges now faced by the society, it is a place where anxiety looms large, where you live in constant fear, not just to yourself, right, whether you will be attacked or not, but to the country, to the state. What you see on the right here is, of course, Ben-Gvir, right, that minister that I mentioned before, and the Hebrew slogan that was unbelievably successful. If you've been in Israel throughout the election campaign, it's remarkable the extent that that slogan seemingly stirred something deep inside many Israelis. It was unthinkable that Ben-Gvir will get to that prominent position that he did. Now, it's hard for me to translate that slogan to English. Mi po baalei habayit is in Hebrew. I guess it's something along the lines of, who here are the landlords? But it's not simply land, it's home. Who are the home owners in the deepest sense of owning a home? And with that question, that of course for Ben-Gvir is completely rhetorical. Of course, the Jews should be the homeowners. This is our home, this is our land, we are the landlords. But putting that as a question mark was triggering to that anxiety, to that uncertainty, which he managed to do remarkably. The slogan that you see on the left in both Hebrew and Arabic basically says that this is the home of us all, of all of us. Sort of the counter slogan, which happened only after the election with the start of the demonstrations. And in many ways, I think that this is the tension that typifies Israeli society today, one versus the other. And in both of those slogans, as symbols, you can see ways to tap into the lived experiences of Israelis amidst these crises. If you took a step back, just a couple of months before the crisis, before the rise of the current government, you can see a public opinion poll such as the one before you. A very, very low sense of agency among Israelis. But I think that the poll on the right is even more remarkable. People were asked if they agree with the current statement, it would be best to dismantle all the country's political institutions and start over from scratch. 43%, almost equally divided, right? 43% agree to a certain extent, somewhat or strongly agree with that statement.
Uriel, we have about 5 minutes left.
Yeah, so I'm wrapping up. And I think that this is what we have to understand about the Israelis when that government rose to power, when it put forth proposals that were ultimately about dismantling democracy. This is a deeply divided society about the very meaning of what it means to be an Israeli. Whether you're Jewish or Arab, secular or religious, Mizrahi or Ashkenazi, to those of you familiar with the ethnic vocabulary in Israel. All of this is playing out as this crisis unfolds. And so many aspects of that, I think, cannot be fully comprehended unless you tap to that sentiment, to that experience. You want potentially to dismantle everything and start from scratch. And one way to do that is really dismantle that 75-year-old democratic institutions that were created. And I would conclude in a way that perhaps combine the political and the personal in political phenomenology. This is Simcha Rotman. He's a member of Knesset. And he is one of the two leading entrepreneurs of the legislative overhaul. And this is how he explains in an interview to us about 2 months ago, how he considers that. And that's what he said. I am King Solomon. I should explain that you must not leave the infant in the hands of those who are willing to burn the country because they lost the election. They demonstrate that they are unworthy to hold it. Our job is to tell these people, guys, you're not the real mother. Now, to those of you who are unfamiliar with the biblical narrative behind this, it's all about Solomon's judgment. Right? Two women approaching King Solomon, telling him that they are the real mother of a certain baby. And of course, King Solomon has no way to know who is the real mother. So his verdict is to cut the baby into half. Give half to one mother, the other half to the other. Then one of the supposed mothers is saying, okay, that's your verdict, so be it. The other supposed mother is saying, no, give it to the other mother. Give it to that woman. And so you may quickly realize what eventually Solomon decided. to give the baby to the mother who said, give it to the other one. Now, what is Rothman doing here? Well, first, yes, he likens himself to King Solomon, which, of course, is interesting in terms of what is the personal experience of that guy. And perhaps not incidentally, right? If you know something about King Solomon, is that in the biblical narrative, he's considered to be the wisest of all people. And if you know a bit about the institutional aspect of what's going on in Israel, so much institutionally is instigated by a group called Kohelet, the Kohelet Forum. Kohelet is the Hebrew name of Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes, of course, a book in the Bible, is considered to be written by King Solomon. Okay, so the dots are nicely connected. Now, basically, what is Simcha Rothman telling us? That as King Solomon is beholding the two women, and those people in the streets demonstrating, don't really love their country. They are willing to burn the country because they lost the election. And that only proves one thing, that they are unworthy. They are not the real mother. By implication, it's obviously enough. We know who the real mother is. Rothman and his count in Israeli form. And that's, for him, almost an exquisite way to demonstrate what is right, what is wrong, both factually and morally. And so again, I think what political phenomenology can help us is gain an insight into the ways that people think, both politicians and the general public. And it leaves us one way or another, I think, with, in Israeli politics at least, in choosing between these two poems. Natan Alterman's, one of Israel's most famed poets, writes about the devil who was wondering how he may overcome the people of Israel. Because these besieged people has courage and talent and implements of war and wits. And then the devil realized, only this shall I do. I'll dull his mind and cause him to forget the justice of his cause. Thus spoke the devil, and sky spelled in horror as the devil ascended to pursue his law. The sense that you have always to be certain about your justice. That certainty is the most important thing. And democracy, if it gets in the way, should be discarded. Juxtaposing that with another poem by Yehuda Amichai. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow. And a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. A suggestion that basically it is actually doubt, not certainty, that can enrich us, can provide us with a way to see better and to do better in the world. And so in between those two, and my inclination, which I guess is obvious by now, to the latter, I am concluding these 4 months in Israel with a sense of hope. And I think that by better understanding the way things have been, we can, in my country, devise a better way to, in some ways, rebuild our society on better foundations. And I hope that this mode of inquiry can make some very, very, very modest contribution to that effort. That's it. Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic. That was really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For sharing with us. We are short on time, So if people have to go, I certainly understand. But if there are any questions for Uriel or comments.
I have something. Yeah, it was such a wonderful presentation. Thank you. I guess I was interested in like why is it political? I mean, obviously you talk a lot about political phenomenology, but like what's, why not just phenomenology if that's so embedded in like everything you talked about, like people's lives, which are, political anyway. So like kind of like what you said about the lived experience, which is like, why do we need the lived term? So like, why do we need the political term of phenomenology?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. It's the sort of question that I don't have a good answer to. But I guess the very, very tentative answer that I do have in mind is that in my reading of politics, there are two aspects that are out there. One is the familiar one. Politics is basically a public struggle over power. This is typically how we interpret politics, and we typically interpret power as control. Our ability to force our will against resistance, occasionally if needed. This is politics. And here it's interesting to say the way in which people experience the matrix of power. What does it mean to them to have or not to have power? And the way that plays out in their society, which is why I emphasize in the case of both Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu, the role of power in their personal imagination and the way that I think it resonates in their political activities. But I think there is another reading of politics, which is perhaps more existential, that is less about control and is more about choice. And here too, it is interesting to see the extent in which, in people's mind, they feel closer to Alterman or to Yehuda Amichai. Whether they feel closer to the possibility of actually we should not embrace choice that is deeply seated without, there is no choice again, without reflection, without doubt, or try to cherish that, the possibility that they might be wrong. So here too, I see that in phenomenology, if you tap into the experiences of people, you can figure out a way in which their individuality and the collective entwine. In some ways, and this is uncharted territory, and I think not just murky, but probably flawed. But in recent months, I began to think about politics as therapy. I think that for many people, we turn to politics in order to resolve something in our personal life. We experience a lot of troubles in our life. That's obvious enough. And yes, we can try to work it out ourselves, which we typically try to do. It's okay then. But we can also export that into society to take our, for example, grievances, resentments, fear, frustrations, but also hope onto the public sphere and try to find some solution over there. And I myself am fascinated by that interview between the personal experience that is often, what we would call psychological, and the way that it manifests itself in politics. I will briefly give one example. One of the things that worked wonderfully well to Netanyahu was his trial, that he was put on trial for various allegations. And in the different contexts, you may wonder, what the hell? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, he's being accused of being a corrupted person. But that was wonderful to Netanyahu because he managed to tap into the sentiment of so many people in Israel that the system is against them. Netanyahu was struggling for months now to have people on the streets favoring the legislative overhaul. And he failed until they managed to find the right slogan. And you know what the right slogan is? We are second-class citizens. And people identified with that fully because this is what they experience in their daily life. This is how they see themselves in their, towns, in their streets, when they look in the news, when they read their bank bills, when they pay their mortgage, whatever that might be. And so Netanyahu for them is potentially the sort of leader that is both experiencing this humiliation by the system, but is strong enough in order to combat that. Now, does it ring any bells? It should, because Netanyahu and Trump have been almost like twins in this phenomenological journey in politics. And I think it's very hard to understand their public appeal if you do not tap into that dimension, let alone trying to make things better. Yeah, I can't hear.
I was going to say, thank you so much. This was such a fantastic. Thank you, Shirley, for that question. Thank you all for coming and joining us today. Thanks to Sharon for taking over the lead of QuIRI. I'm really excited for you and for QuIRI. And I hope you all have a wonderful end of the semester, and we will see you next fall. Take care. Thank you, Uriel.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Uriel, that was great. Bye, Shirley.